Of covering a story can never get in the way of our doing our job. And so we begin tonight where Peter left us, with what turned out to be his last report on his own illness.
Finally, this evening, a brief note about change. Some of you have noticed in the last several days that I was not covering the Pope.
I didn't watch it. I didn't want to watch it. I didn't want to hear what I knew was in Peter's voice.
As some of you now know, I have learned in the last couple of days that I have lung cancer.
To be enduring something like this seemed simply incomprehensible.
Yes, I was a smoker until about 20 years ago. And I was weak, and I smoked over 9/11.
Even though I knew about his smoking history, was surprised when he made it public in his announcement.
But whatever the reason, the news does slow you down a bit.
It was so typical of him to announce that he had lung cancer, to say it himself, to not gloss it over.
But almost 10 million Americans are already living with cancer, and I have a lot to learn from them. And living is the key word.
Emphasis on the word living. He could deliver his lines with such elan, and he did that night.
Guts, it took a lot of guts.
I didn't want to see somebody that I thought was an absolutely immovable and invulnerable force, acknowledging that indeed he was vulnerable.
I will continue to the broadcast. On good days, my voice will not always be like this.
Yet in his voice was all of our fear and hope and anxiety and faith.
And I hope it goes without saying that a journalist who doesn't value deeply the audience's loyalty should be in another line of work. To be perfectly honest, I'm a little surprised at the kindness today from so many people. That's not intended as false modesty, but even I was taken aback by how far and how fast news travels. Finally, I wonder if other men and women ask their doctors right away, "Okay, doc, when does the hair go?" At any rate, that's it for now in World News Tonight. Have a good evening. I'm Peter Jennings. Thanks and good night.
From ABC News World Headquarters in New York, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening. We are here in Detroit tonight.
I like doing what I'm doing because it is always an adventure. I'm always going somewhere in the country.
Good evening from Philadelphia. From the badly damaged Marina District of San Francisco.
Somewhere in a neighborhood, somewhere overseas.
Good evening. It's been a busy day. From the Berlin Wall. Good evening from Paris. This was an historic day. Earlier today in Baghdad. In Moscow today. Good evening from Jerusalem.
I don't think I've ever, in all those years, ever been bored for more than half an hour at a time.
When Dr. King was killed, the city named this street after him. The trouble is, it runs right through the ghetto.
45 minutes. And everybody was in their beds, apparently.
Yeah.
So it was a surprise.
Yeah.
It was a disaster, one of the worst attacks since this war began.
Good morning, Mr. President.
Hello, Peter.
Are you completely and absolutely in charge? In this house all the time?
No, I wouldn't say that.
Is that okay? Thank you very much. Other one, please.
He was almost childlike in his embrace of being in the field, of meeting new people and seeing new sights and finding new stories. I mean, he had a firm belief that you could take any good reporter and plunk them down in the middle of anywhere, and they could just walk down the street and find 10 great stories.
We did not plan to come all this way to do a traffic report. But reporters are always looking for a metaphor so that people at home might better understand a foreign country.
We were in Kalani Square the other day. Iraqis were going nowhere when some American VIP was trying to get somewhere. Just watch.
Never let me forget that this is a constant education. This is a constant learning process. That you never know as much as you think you know, and there's always more to learn.
All along this line in the sand, which President Bush drew in Washington, 650 miles down to the Persian Gulf. Geography is important.
That was Peter. He wanted to know everything, and he wanted to make sure that we did too.
He was like the Pied Piper with children. He never talked down to kids.
Jemima, did you want to say something, love?
He would squat down, he'd look at them in the eye, and he'd engage them. He'd engage them in a dialogue, but he was talking to them, never down to them.
Listen, I promise you, you'll be 6 foot tall one of these days. Right? At the moment. This is Jake. Yeah, Jake.
And he covered the stories that he thought were important and fought to have them covered.
There was compassion. There was compassion for people. He hated people who were downtrodden or stepped on. I think that's why he loved big pieces of the third world.
What do your mother and father tell you what the future is going to be about?
They don't talk about that.
How come?
They don't know what to say me.
They don't know what to tell you about the
Yes.
future.
Peter was curious about everything. I honestly can't think of anything that he wasn't curious about.
When we went into Iraq, all of us who were embedded, like all the military, wore chemical suits. And Peter was under the impression that there was no getting out of these suits, that these things were hermetically sealed.
I think I'm asking you a question that some people in the audience will want to know about. So in those chem bio suits, what do you do if you want to go to the bathroom?
They have zippers, Peter.
Oh, they do have zippers.
But,
okay.
I just had to laugh. I said, well, Peter, there's a zipper.
His depth of knowledge, self-taught in so many areas, was extraordinary.
The largest and most important cemetery in all of Israel, both for political and military leaders.
Remember when Yitzhak Rabin died? We did Good Morning America about 3 hours after I landed, and then Peter went on with a special. And in the midst of the special, he began talking about the cemetery in which Rabin would be buried.
The edge of the Jerusalem forest of pine and cypress trees, many of them brought from Lebanon.
And the significance of the trees that surrounded the cemetery. How many they were, where they came from, what their religious significance was. I'm going through my briefing books. Where did he get that? He just knew it.
So what you had by the last 15, 20 years of Peter's career was a complete package.
Once again from Times Square, Peter Jennings.
Well, Times Square looks a little bit like the celebration has already begun. In fact, we were out there pretty early this morning. Hello, everybody, and welcome to a brand new adventure for ABC News.
A man who had the background, who had the reservoir of knowledge, and who had the ability to process all of that information at the same time that all hell is breaking loose in his ear.
Chaos in New York at the moment. There have been not one but 2 incidents, as Charlie and Diane have so ably reported so far. The second one coming at 9:03, when television was on live and you could see what was clearly a jet aircraft.
Never to convey any sense of that panic, but indeed, to the contrary, conveying a sense of, it's all right, it's going to be okay, I'm going to process this, the information, I'll let you know what's happening, I'll let you know what you need to know, don't worry about it.
He was trying to make the product as good as it can be, just as he was a perfectionist about himself, and making himself as good as he could be.
3, 2, 1, announce. This is an ABC New York 2.
I don't think people always realize what a good time journalists have every day of their lives, and why we are, in some respects, passionate about doing what we do. I get up every day thinking that something is going to happen in the world that I didn't know about yesterday, and I have the opportunity to pass some of that on to the audience. I get up every day knowing that I can learn or understand something better, and that it is my job to do so. That people will pay me to do that in order to help people understand the environment in which we live. That's fabulously exciting. No wonder we're passionate. We'd be nuts if we didn't like that.
The Walt Disney Company mourns the loss of Peter Jennings and wishes to express heartfelt sympathy to his family and to all of his friends and colleagues at ABC News.
He was a very high-spirited and mischievous little boy. He was full of sport. He was full of fun. It was always great fun to be in Peter's wake. If you could hang on, you'd always have a good time.
For Sarah Jennings and her older brother, life with their parents, Charles and Elizabeth, meant high standards right from the start.
Peter was such an attractive little boy that people had high expectations of him. And from a very, very early age, he tried to respond to that, to do his best.
He was driven by a sense that he had to match, if not exceed, his father. Charles Jennings had been referred to as the Edward R. Murrow of Canada.
Peter's relationship with his father was very, very important in terms of the kind of person that Peter turned out to be. Peter's mother was a very elegant lady, and she was very attractive, and she was a very big part of his life. She was a strong value person that he would bounce ideas off, and I think he wanted to please her too.
Peter had this story, which he would tell off and on, about his father, in which he said his father would say, come out here now and describe this cloud pattern. And he would come out and he'd say, well, you know, there's white clouds and there's some blue sky. And then he'd say, now, take that cloud pattern, divide it like a pie into 8 pieces, and describe the 8 pieces. In a way to teach Peter that there was description, and then there was description.
And so Peter clearly wanted to follow in his father's footsteps, and did in many strange ways, in the sense he had a radio program when he was 9 years old.
When Peter was just 9 and his father was working overseas, the Canadian Broadcasting Company came calling.
CBC programmers came to Mum and asked if Peter could be allowed to host a Saturday morning music program for children. And Mum agreed. And Peter indeed did start the job. And when Dad came home, he was flabbergasted and outraged.
Years later, in a Canadian TV documentary, Peter remembered it differently.
He was very pleased, but his only severe reaction that I recall was immediately phoning the CBC accounting department saying, you are paying my son far too much money, and cut it down to $5. And it was called Peter's Program, and the title which I have abhorred, ever since I grew up.
Was it your boyhood ambition to always be in broadcasting?
Without question.
It was.
In fact, it worries me now because I think that if I hadn't got into it, I couldn't have done anything else.
Peter was an astonishing combination of insecurity and great self-confidence. He always seemed to worry about the fact that he had never graduated from high school when you asked him about it. He was always reading on airplanes. He was always looking into stories before he went and doing all of his research. But when he was on a story, you could tell he had a great deal of self-confidence about how to talk to people, about how to get them to open up on camera.
Do you know anything about the political parties in this country?
Oh, as much as any teenager, I guess.
By his early 20s, he was on Canadian television and already very comfortable in front of the camera.
To become very emotionally involved with an animal as much like a teddy bear as this one.
I think Peter just loved what he was doing. I think from day one he had this great passion and enthusiasm for radio, for television, for broadcasting, for communicating.
We were both young. We were both in our mid-20s. But that was, to some extent, the nature of television news in those days. There weren't a lot of people with a lot of skills on TV. So the notion of putting young people on it was really not so surprising at that time.
We know that CJOH...
At just 24, Peter was named an anchor on Canada's first commercial network.
For Magdalene families...
In New York, ABC executives liked what they saw and decided to hire him. Elmer Lauer was president of ABC News.
We were looking for anybody with any kind of promise at all at that time. It was hard to get people to work for ABC then because they never believed ABC would put up the money to compete with CBS and NBC.
At about 1:15 this afternoon, a lone Negro came down and tried to enter the Lester Maddox cafeteria.
ABC, when Peter joined, was not the ABC News of today.
Ted Koppel had come to ABC 1 year earlier.
It was really to both of our benefits that it was such a pathetic news division, because they wouldn't have hired a couple of kids like us. We met for the first time, really met, where we became friends on the Goldwater campaign. There was the secondary television correspondent, his name was Peter Jennings, and there was the radio correspondent, and his name was Ted Koppel.
Peter was learning to be a reporter, but he wasn't much of an actor.
Well, he's one of our newer employees. Very diligent, very hardworking. Will you say hello to Peter Jennings?
What do I have to? I'm working.
Peter was a presence, always. And when I say a presence, it wasn't just women who looked up when Peter walked into a room, and by golly, they did look up. I mean, Peter was movie star handsome. and he had an aura about him. It just radiated from Peter. And somehow you felt more alive when Peter Jennings was in the room.
In 1965, when Peter was 26, ABC took a second gamble.
I think he impressed us as having all the physical attributes. He looks well, he speaks well.
Peter Jennings with the news. Good evening.
Peter was named anchor of the third place ABC Evening News, just a 15-minute broadcast. He covered the big stories.
Now from our ABC studio in New York, Peter Jennings.
We will have more on the flight of Apollo 11.
The Meredith March began in Memphis, Tennessee 3 weeks ago.
The death of Dr. Martin Luther King, he said, is a tragedy for all Americans.
Little here in the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon.
But Peter carried some excess baggage from Canada.
Then you ought to say we're going to... Yeah.
He used words like aboot for about and lieutenant and schedule. Initially, he bristled, and he didn't want to give up these things. That was a short-lived resistance, and I think very soon he realized that if he was going to work for an American audience and speak to an American audience, he'd best not do it with a foreign accent.
He wanted to appear older.
No makeup out of the eyes. A boss of mine in Ottawa once said to me, he said, Peter, what you really need most of all in this profession, he said, are a few lines in your face. And so I won't let the makeup man make up underneath my eyes because I've begun to develop, just very slight sort of 27-year-old bags under my eyes. And I think, aha, you see, I'm beginning to look a little more distinguished, a little more convincing, a little more like I know what I'm talking about.
Coming out on 2 or 3.
A complex mixture of confidence and concern. It is a line Peter walked his entire life.
I had to cross the border before people thought I had any talent.
How long is this VTR from Toledo?
Part of the makeup of a good journalist, and Peter was a good journalist, is a certain insecurity. An insecurity, did I get the story right? Do I have all the facts? Do I understand the larger context? And maybe also an element of wanting to please people.
I think it took a lot of confidence for him to come down and, at such a young age, really think that he could make a run of it against such sterling and established broadcasters as Walter Cronkite.
There was a lot of criticism about ABC taking on this young Canadian, telling the news of America. They would like to have seen, a much longer apprentice period.
The critics were harsh.
They thought he was too young. They thought he was inexperienced. They thought he was too pretty. They thought he had too many girls around. And they thought he was being paid too much money.
I make $40,000 a year more than I did in Canada.
5 seconds on.
When he failed to raise the ratings and ruffled some feathers, Peter made a choice. He could have gone to local news and been a star. Instead, he took the biggest chance of his young career.
You had these crusty old print veterans who were ostensibly reporting to this young whippersnapper of an anchor who was all of 26 years old, clearly didn't have a lot of experience, clearly didn't know a great deal. And Peter was smart enough and sensitive enough to realize that this wasn't going to work. And after a couple of years, he went to his bosses at ABC News and said, I think I should get out of this role, and I think I need to learn my trade. And will you send me overseas?
He was very grateful for the opportunity that he could become a foreign correspondent, and which opened up the whole world to him.
I want to reach the point where Walter Cronkite or his counterpart at that future date will say, Peter Jennings is a good news correspondent. He is a good communicator. He is a good broadcaster. He is a good human being.
Peter Jennings, reporter, continues.
Live from around the world, a celebration of the millennium.
For the next 24 hours, we're going to try to share this extraordinary occasion with much of the rest of the world.
The Millennium broadcast, he had the decathlon of broadcasts because he's live, he's throwing all over the world. He's changing clothes.
The 21st century has already arrived in parts of the Pacific, so let's go first to Perth in Australia, where they are playing down the sun.
And to be able to keep that going all day long with never a commonplace phrase, never a cliche, is the work of an Olympian.
Peter was very nervous about that broadcast. He was cramming and studying.
And he had these 3x5 index cards, this big stack of 3x5 index cards, which he was basically memorizing. He was going through, memorizing essentially every fact about the world for 2,000 years.
It's very exciting to go around the world, and we're about to celebrate 3 more midnights in Greece, in Bethlehem, and in Egypt. But here is the celebration with the doves of peace to mark the new millennium.
What he did was quickly realize the tone of all of this.
The Brandenburg Gate in a unified Berlin for the first time since the end of World War II. Midnight in Moscow. What history has transpired here.
The most memorable moment was when there was a very large, beautiful celebration in Red Square in Moscow. And we went immediately to Jim Wooten in a refugee camp in sub-Saharan Africa.
Outside Red Square, tremendous hope. Let's go to ABC's Jim Wooten on the Horn of Africa. Hey, Jim, the Russians and Soviets and the Americans and everybody else have fought over that neck of the woods where you're standing now.
That's absolutely true. I was about to say you want some contrast in this broadcast, going from midnight in Moscow to midnight in Ali Ade. Just listen. There's not a sound here. 11,000 refugees from Somalia with no particular reason to celebrate.
It was pitch black and people were sleeping out in the cold. Only Peter could understand both of those situations, could bring those to us.
He gave it height and depth and reach, and he made it about this unifying band of humanity, which is, I think, his theme at the end of the day. I think that's always his theme.
No.
This is really not much more than a simple game the children and I have devised. What they may not understand is that almost every time we snap our fingers, a new child is born in India.
I learned so much watching him work there about how to make things come alive. And he just gathered some Indian street kids around him and started doing this, and they started imitating him.
The late Indian Prime Minister Nehru often used to wonder what animals must think of man.
One on camera he did just from the back of an elephant. He always made the point, don't stand like you're in front of a stage set. Touch the surroundings where you are.
At 30, Peter was convinced that he couldn't understand the world from behind an anchor desk without having really lived in it. So he asked to be assigned overseas.
One of Peter's great qualities was this curious mind that he had. And it was not just in topical literature or books, but he really wanted to know what other people think.
Peter didn't have a formal university education, but he was better read than most of the people I know who did. He was always reading. Whenever we would fly, say, from Beirut to Cairo, or Cairo to Algiers, or Algiers to Damascus, wherever we were going, he had books. He'd always take books, not a book, books with him on every airplane, and in the evenings he wouldn't go get drunk in the bar with the rest of us. He would be up reading.
He said, in fact, that he found this job to be one of the great education that was paid for by ABC.
The Israeli helicopters coming over from behind a ridge just 2 ridges away from us.
Peter was the first network correspondent based in the Middle East, and he absorbed the politics and the culture of the region like a sponge.
It's also been made clear to us by the Army that the Lebanese Army is going to occupy former guerrilla positions. That's not going to make the Palestinian commandos very happy, but it may be exactly what the Israelis wanted.
There was a great applause when the nation of Israel walked in here. And
his knowledge of the Arab world and the PLO in particular would be invaluable when he was asked to cover the Munich Olympics in 1972.
The Germans are cheering the Jewish athletes.
I had tried to have someone from ABC News there because it is a world news event, number one, and number two, you never know what's going to happen.
So my boss, Rune Arlich, called and said, would you like some rest and relaxation from the Middle East story, and would you come to Munich and do all of our non-sports features? I said yes. Took me all 10 seconds to say yes.
On the 11th day of the Games, masked terrorists attacked Israel's Olympic team, killing 2 athletes immediately and taking 9 others hostage.
Peter Jennings is inside the village. Let's go to Peter now.
One of the things that is concerning people here now is a report that with them the guerrillas brought explosives and have them inside the building. If I were to guess at the moment at which of the commando organizations this group is to come from, I'd be most likely to narrow in on a group called Black September.
Munich was a major turning point in Peter's career. He already had credibility as a first-rate international correspondent. But he really owned this story in a very clear sense. The other networks couldn't even get on the air from Munich.
I did not know Peter Jennings. Nobody did at that time.
The Middle East, Israel and the Arab countries is like one of the evil pendulums of history, which just goes back and forth and back and forth.
We got finished and listened to his reporting. I remember seeing him and Jim McKay on camera after it was over and could not believe what we were seeing. And it really was, in my opinion, the beginning of Peter Jennings.
Even before Munich, it had been clear to colleagues that Peter was an extraordinary broadcaster. But afterwards, there was a kind of mystique, an aura that clung to him.
Peter was born to be a dashing foreign correspondent. He walked into my hotel room in Beirut wearing a cravat and a sort of a safari suit, and I thought it was James Bond.
This is Peter Jennings, ABC News, Ramallah.
Peter led a very glamorous life overseas, and he certainly gave the perception of tossing off his stories between skin dives. He jetted around the world, and he knew everybody, and everybody came to know him. And if you were in his wake, which I often was, that I would be sent to maybe a location where he had been, people would immediately ask you, do you know Peter Jennings? If you say you worked for ABC, well, do you know Peter Jennings? He impressed everybody right away.
It is virtually all sand.
He loved being a foreign correspondent. And in fact, I suspected that maybe that's really what he really loved the most.
He was handsome as a movie star, wildly intelligent and curious fellow, and he made a great many friends there.
Peter, of course, was an extremely good-looking man. I always thought he looked a bit like Errol Flynn. And he's tall, and he was well-built and very athletic and enormously charming. I mean, he could turn on the charm like a searchlight. And that was devastating to a lot of women.
The Palestinian...
I think women found Peter absolutely irresistible. I knew that every time he would come to see me, all my classmates and college kids would just go berserk.
Walk down any country road in Cuba.
Peter was a very compassionate guy. He was a combination of compassion and discipline. When you'd see him sometimes tearing up when he was listening to somebody tell their story, whatever their religion, you could tell that he was listening to the person.
He is 61 years old, this man. When the earthquake struck, he was outside his house. His wife and 3 children, his brother and his 3 children were inside. They still are. The sadness here is incalculable. Those are a few of the people. But there are 50 villages here, and there are more than 50,000 people homeless. As for the dead, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000, the figures seem inane to a man who is either burying or still looking for his wife and children.
I can remember going to villages in South Lebanon with him, and he'd suddenly disappear, and you'd find him playing soccer in some garden with a bunch of kids. He just got along with everybody from all sectors of society.
Peter was deadly serious about his journalism, skeptical about conventional wisdom, and not inclined to toe the official line.
I think the fact that he came from, not from big America, but from a slightly smaller country just to the north, he understood something of being something of an outsider.
Peter had been to the 4 corners of the earth. I mean, he knew the back streets of cities, the dusty roads of villages.
Until the Palestinians have some measure of self-determination, America's efforts in the Middle East will ultimately flounder.
But the Middle East and the controversy that surrounded his reporting of the Arab-Israeli conflict followed him to the end.
There was supposed to be a ceasefire today between Israelis and the Palestinians, but passions are clearly too inflamed. Many walls are covered with pictures of the boy who was shot on Saturday. His mother said that if President Clinton is moved by the death of her son, he should stop the Israelis from doing what they're doing.
Peter became a target for his coverage in the Middle East. Many people felt he was anti-Israeli or pro-Palestinian. I don't think he was that way. I think that he felt he was trying to redress balances in what he felt was an undercovered Palestinian story, underexposed in a way.
So he was both pro-Arab and pro-Israeli. He loved Arabs and Israelis and had close friends in the Arab world and in Israel.
Fatme, just 6, breaks down when there is talk of her mother. Like the 48,
he probably was skeptical of people in power and the lies that they tell to stay in power, or the lies that they tell to send people into war.
The damage has been extensive. This has been the biggest attack on Lebanon ever, and the local officials say hundreds of houses have been destroyed and hundreds of Lebanese left homeless. The Israelis say they were used by the commandos. The Lebanese say by innocent villagers. Israeli jets make a final pass over the valley. The villagers remark bitterly that the planes were a gift from America.
I think that the early accusations that Peter was pro-Palestinian came at a time when there was very, very little attention being paid to the Arab side generally, and certainly to the Palestinians, and that anyone who was willing to talk about them and to try to explain their position and so on was seen as carrying their baggage, as it were.
Deba Moussa knows nothing of Geneva Conventions. She knows she's afraid of the Israelis. But when the first bombs fell, her daughter ran, was hit, and not seen again.
The fact that Peter dared to go beyond the cliché and the label and seek the truth made many people label him as being pro-Palestinian or pro-Arab.
As a colleague, an ABC producer, and as an Israeli, I admired Peter's reporting of the Middle East. But as an Israeli, I can also tell you that there are people that felt that Peter was not even-handed, which comes from when you live in that country as an Israeli, a country that in the 50 years of its lifespan has seen terror attack after terror attack on a daily basis.
Well, there is something that every Lebanese man and woman fears more than any shelling. It is the car bomb. And yet another one exploded this morning in a working-class district of West Beirut. Just one picture will tell you how wretched man can be to his fellow man.
I was at the scene of that car bombing, and for the journalists there, we wondered what was the point of subjecting ourselves to all of this violence if nobody was going to see our reports. But when Peter saw that footage, he knew that this image of the injured child was an icon, really, of the whole war, and he was determined that the whole world would see it.
There was this wounded girl, and there were at least 14 people killed, more than 80 others wounded. Some people said, how can you do that at the dinner time? Our children are watching. That's a problem for me, because I don't want my children growing up looking at that violence. Conversely, I don't want to be in a position of sanitizing the news. What do? I don't really know what you do. I don't think I would do that again in a hurry. But every day you make those kinds of decisions.
Even though Peter was such an outstanding anchor, he was never content just to remain in that anchor chair. He was dying to get back out in the field that he loved so much and report on the major stories that he knew had to be brought to the American people and often were being ignored. So pretty much from the beginning, Peter insisted on doing major documentaries from around the world and around the country for that matter. And because he did those documentaries, he literally changed what governments did, how people lived their lives, and he changed the world around him because of the importance of his reporting.
February the 5th, 1994. A few minutes of videotape and everything changes. Or seems to. A single mortar shell falls on the open-air market in Sarajevo. 68 people are blown to pieces.
We were the first crew there, and it was a human butcher shop. It was the worst thing I have ever seen. Peter didn't run for cover. He went right into the middle of it.
This is a market that everybody thought was protected.
Yeah.
Peter was willing to risk his life for a great story, and that's what he did in Bosnia. It was a hugely risky thing for Peter to go to Bosnia because there were people there with guns who wanted to see Peter dead. And Peter had the courage to insist on going there.
Maybe half an hour after this attack occurred in the marketplace, more than 30 people have been admitted to the Kosovo hospital who are actually wounded. That doesn't include the dead. That would make it among the worst attacks since this war began.
It was that important to him that he go and tell America, tell the world, about another genocide in Europe.
This is Europe in the 1990s. This was not supposed to happen again. For nearly half a century, the United States had committed so much to keep the peace. And then European cities were devastated by war again. This time, the United States stood by.
Imagine that the U.S. government knew that there were concentration camps in Bosnia and wouldn't confirm it because they didn't want political pressure to be brought on them to do something about it.
Were you ever told by anyone in the department to deliberately not tell the truth?
Yes.
By whom? And on what subject?
Well, it was on this subject. I was told that we couldn't afford to continue to confirm the existence of these camps.
We could not afford to continue confirming the existence of the concentration camps.
That's right.
And who told you that?
I was told that by a senior official on the 7th floor of the State Department when I tried to get this language changed.
Is it the Secretary of State or the acting Secretary of State you have in mind?
It's the top of the building I have in mind.
Peter didn't mince words. He said, this is the biggest failure since the creation of the United Nations. That is to say, the failure of the UN peacekeeping effort in Bosnia. And he was right. We interviewed the United Nations general on the ground who was in charge of the peacekeeping effort, a man named Michael Rose.
When the Serbs are shelling a civilian population, do you say, that's a war crime?
Of course, any shelling of a civilian population is a war crime.
And do you therefore feel, when it's occurring, that you have got to do something about it? That your mandate requires you to do something about it?
We always do something about it.
Well, you don't, really, do you?
We always do something about it. If there is a deliberate shelling of a civilian population by one side or the other, then we will use force against them.
But that is not what the general did. The shelling of Gorazde continued. The United Nations did not call in airstrikes. And with no real threat to stop them, the Serbs unleashed an all-out assault on the town.
Peter Jennings is the man more than anyone else who saved Bosnia and Bosnians. And when Peter was sick, I wrote him and told him what a magnificent thing he had done. You know, Peter should know that one of his legacies are a lot of people who are alive today in Bosnia who might not have been.
These are the foot soldiers of the Khmer Rouge. The last time the Khmer Rouge ruled in Cambodia, they killed more than 1 million of their fellow citizens, maybe even 2 million. Today, the communist Khmer Rouge are back, advancing on their own people again. Like the Nazis, the Khmer Rouge kept a meticulous record of their crimes. They often took photographs of what they did to their victims.
We had figured out, through one of our great reporters that we work with, that the United States was supporting the non-communist resistance in Cambodia with lethal weapons, which was actually against American law. And as a result, they were supporting the Khmer Rouge, which was against American morality. And we thought that was a story that needed to be told.
Are people in Congress aware that the Khmer Rouge and the non-communist coalition operate together in the field?
I think people are aware that the walls between the non-communist resistance and the Khmer Rouge are coming down.
This is what he's referring to. The soldier on the left is the non-communist. Those on the right, in the plain green, are Khmer Rouge.
This question of cooperation between the non-communist resistance and the Khmer Rouge, you say it doesn't exist. Am I correct?
we see no pattern of cooperation among these people that gets to the problem that we're all worried about, which is the Khmer Rouge making a military comeback. We have repeatedly indicated to Prince Sihanouk and others that anything that looks like that cooperation is absolutely a no-no, unacceptable to us.
And if they were fighting together, side by side, you would find that, in your words, unacceptable?
Absolutely, and we have indicated so very clearly to Sihanouk and the other non-communists.
What would we do about it?
The law, if there was a judgment made that this violated the law, then we would have to cut off arms.
To the non-communist resistance?
Correct. We are not supplying, support. We do not supply lethal support, but we would have to cut off our support to the non-communists.
In fact, you did say we would have to cut off arms to the non-communist resistance.
I made a mistake there. We do not supply any lethal assistance to the non-communists.
What's particularly striking about this interview with an American official is he made a horrendous mistake, the American official. He actually told the truth when he was trying not to.
According to sources on all sides of the conflict who know the United States does supply weapons and ammunition to the non-communists. The weapons arrive here in Cambodia via America's allies, Singapore and Thailand. You can see them everywhere in the war zone.
Now, as a result of this documentary, the American policy changed. Congress adopted a resolution that forbade the American government from giving any support to anyone in Cambodia. And it was really one example, I think, one of the best examples of the power of a journalist, Peter Jennings, to fundamentally change something significant.
So much suffering, such a tortured history. It really isn't so complicated after all. Cambodia in danger of being plunged into darkness again. The United States in danger of being on the wrong side of history. As we have already said, Jewish prophecy declares that when the Messiah comes, he will come to Jerusalem. Jerusalem at this moment seen from across the small valley of Kidron. We're actually on the Mount of Olives. Picture the scene, if you can, 2,000 years ago. It is the...
I remember at one point we were filming Peter talking on camera for one of our documentaries at the top of the Mount of Olives. And he said, you know, it's amazing. I remember when the Israelis captured this part of Jerusalem. And I was here when they buried the first Israeli soldier in this cemetery. It was extremely moving. He loved the Middle East. He loved it. He loved the language. He loved the complexity. He loved the layers and layers and layers of history.
I have never met anyone who has come to Jerusalem and didn't have the most vivid experiences. I first came here as a reporter in 1967, right after the Israeli army had captured the old city from the Jordanian army during the Six-Day War. I couldn't begin to tell you everything there is to know and to believe about the power and the mystery of this very small place.
To see Peter in Jerusalem was to really see him in his element. He was so happy when he got off the plane, and he was so happy walking around the old city of Jerusalem, stopping and talking to the falafel salesman and the Israeli policeman and the guy guarding the mosque. It wasn't just that he knew the Middle East. The Middle East knew him. Everyone knew who he was.
You are slime bucket.
All of a sudden, there was this man yelling at me that I was a liar and a slime bucket.
He just engaged the guy, and he took him aside, and he interviewed him.
What do you think the future of Jerusalem is?
In the long run?
Or in the short run?
In the short run, it's going to be nasty here, because nobody is willing to let go.
As the guy walked away, he said to me, I'm very glad I got a chance to talk to him about this. So that was Peter. He sort of elegantly turned it into, you know, something good.
So we had lost the interview with the rabbi because we'd had our cameras with a Muslim, Ali Klebo, near the Jewish synagogue. And now we couldn't interview Ali Klebo here because we had been seen talking to a member of the synagogue. So much for the history lessons today. There is so much hostility between India and Pakistan. The biggest mistake anyone can make is to underestimate the capacity which Indians and Pakistanis have for thinking they can resolve their differences by going to war. To be very clear, a nuclear war between India and Pakistan is not beyond the realm of possibility. And if it happens, millions of innocent people will die.
Going to India and looking at and Pakistan and looking at the way these two countries that are so close in so many ways hate each other so deeply, both of whom are now nuclear powers, was something that Americans needed to know about. It is in fact one of the most dangerous parts of the world, but it's a part of the world that gets very little attention from the American government.
So east of it,
this Indian officer has been fighting Pakistan his whole career.
5 kilometers, Pakistan is holding on to the Putujar Range.
This is east.
So as you are now seeing in front,
everything is controlled by Pakistan forces.
Everything is in Pakistan.
Peter interviewed some of the most important officials on both sides of that potential conflict. But he also insisted on getting out there, going up into the mountains, talking to the soldiers who were on the front line, and seeing what life was really like and reporting it from the ground up.
Do nuclear weapons play any role in your thinking at all?
No, unless, of course, when he fires, then, of course, we have to retaliate.
It is precisely because retaliation now means the possibility of nuclear retaliation that the fight over Kashmir has become so dangerous. It was here, in these mountains last summer, that India and Pakistan brought the world to the brink of a nuclear exchange. It was the first time in history that two nuclear-armed countries were engaged in active combat.
How close did they come to using nuclear weapons in the summer of '99?
It was a real concern, not just to us and to other third parties, I think, but to the two principals themselves.
You know, the very, very end of that show is this peculiar scene at this border between India and Pakistan where the military guards from both sides perform this kind of ritual military dance each day with each other. And ending with that really reflects Peter's sensibility, because if you've been to a lot of dangerous places, you realize that lots of things happen that often get missed. And there are always connections between people that sometimes you don't see. And Indians and Pakistanis are the same people. They just happen to have these deep differences that cause profound hatred and make the world an exceptionally dangerous place.
India and Pakistan are family, and yet they are headed in the direction of war again.
Peter Jennings, reporter, continues.
When you're a kid, a Canadian kid, what is your view of the United States? Are you like peeking over the border, or is it not a factor? But you know what I mean.
I do very much. I think it very much depends how you were brought up. My father tried to come here in the Depression. He was offered a job by NBC, and they threw him off the train at the border. So by the time he got back to Toronto, everybody was still hungover from his going-away party. That's just serious. They still were. And the guy said, "You're coming to America to take an American's job. Go back." Right. And he went back and never came. My mother was an imperialist, and her father had served in the First World War with a Canadian regiment. She was pretty anti-American. And so I was, in some respects, raised with anti-Americanism in my blood, or in my mother's milk, at least.
It didn't stick. He grew up with a fascination about America, and by the time he returned to the United States in 1983, he was a citizen of the world with a distinctly American perspective.
Good evening. We begin tonight by concentrating...
He was now the senior editor and sole anchor of World News Tonight.
Can I get any of you guys to talk politics?
He had been overseas a long time, though, and it wasn't an easy adjustment.
There was a considerable lack of knowledge about what had been going on in this country. Not his fault. He'd been covering the rest of the world, and he had this second shot at being the sole anchor, and he was determined to make it work.
The point I wanted to make about
politics was a major stumbling block. Peter didn't know the players.
It is 9:30 in the east, 8:30 in the west. The polls are beginning to close through. We have not called the Senate race in Minnesota.
Peter, in Minnesota, we did call the Senate race, so Rudy Boschwitz, a Republican.
Yeah, I meant to say president.
Right.
I say Senate.
The president we have not.
We're joined in our election headquarters now by Dr. Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State, former National Security Advisor to President Reagan. What's a Reagan foreign policy going to look like in a second term? Same as the first term?
I don't want President Reagan to have a heart attack. I was not Security Advisor to President Reagan.
I beg your pardon, President Nixon, you're quite right.
He'd been out of the country for years, and he had to get caught up on American politics. We went to Iowa first, and then we went to New Hampshire, and we just roamed, and off we'd go. I was his teacher, but I learned an awful lot from him.
And I think Peter ended up, you've heard the term already, I'm sure, falling in love with America. And a lot of that had to do with the coverage of the politics. You can't cover American politics with all of its yeastiness and flavor without having a love of this country.
Peter covered 8 presidential elections and 15 national political conventions. He used to joke that he was addicted.
He loved being out there on the floor so much, they had to drag him off of there and say, Peter, get back in the booth. We need you to anchor the show, not to be out here interviewing people. He wanted to be out there on the floor with the rest of us. He wanted a piece of the action. He wanted to touch the people.
He would go around the clock. I mean, look at even last year, even the last convention, 2004, we didn't even have more than an hour or two of coverage a night on the network, but he insisted on going basically gavel to gavel on our ABC News Now, and he was enjoying every single minute of it.
They're always testing the sound system.
This is life backstage here.
First and foremost, he was a reporter, and that's what brought the stories alive, the people he found. And he would focus on, you know, one important detail, one person, and let that person tell the story.
Would you mind talking to me, any or all of you, about the reality of drugs in your life?
Because he looked at America as this great coming together of different cultures. Peter had a sensitivity for issues for people of color. Maybe it was because he wasn't born here and could look at it differently. But he did it also in a way that you didn't feel that he was being phony. He made you feel that he did it because he really believed that there needs to be a real story about everybody.
We are people of every imaginable thought process, every imaginable color, every imaginable language. We all come here because this is a place I think people can feel they can best realize themselves. Not everybody feels like that, but most Americans, I think, feel they can realize themselves. Hopes and dreams is one way to put it. In this particular country. But because we have different hopes and dreams from one another, different political persuasions, different religious persuasions, it what makes it a dynamic country, which is what makes it heaven for a reporter.
Good evening, Mr. Jennings, and welcome to San Diego, America's finest city.
I was wondering when we get the Chamber of Commerce out here.
When he would take World News Tonight on the road, Peter would hold local town meetings, televised by the affiliates. He said those meetings energized him.
I wish you'd give me some example at some point on which you believed I editorialized.
Well, it's not just you. I mean, Tom Brokaw, they all do it. And to be honest with you, I don't watch it because
and in defense of Tom Brokaw, even.
Peter became enamored of American values, customs, traditions. In this documentary, he used Little League Baseball as a window into relationships.
This is a story about a championship season and its heroes. About a community, its parents, and their children.
Watch the ball, watch the ball! Come on, man!
Peter was always probing. There was no head of state involved here, no politician. This was a father whose actions Peter wanted to understand.
Before this game, we witnessed an exchange between father and son. Chris was upset with what he perceived as Jeremy's laziness during team warm-ups.
Come here. I'm going to tell you something, brother. You're going to leave me down. I know you are. When I get you home, Jeremy, listen to me. I'm going to kick you. I don't care. You didn't want to bend down, Jeremy. Jeremy, I'm on camera and microphone. I'm going to get you tonight because you let me down, brother.
No, I'm not.
You did. I don't give what you do. You let me down. I don't care if you're going to play 100%. I'll get you, buddy. Cry about that.
When we were filming you, you were lecturing Jeremy And you're even threatening him.
What, threatening?
Mm.
No. I never threatened a boy.
Shall I tell you what you said?
Tell me what I said.
You said, come here, I want to tell you something, brother. You want to let me down? I know you are. When I get you home... And then Jeremy said, the ball passes me every time. And you say, but Jeremy, I'm going to kick you. I don't care. You didn't even want to bend down. Jeremy, I'm on camera with a microphone, but I'm going to get you tonight because you're letting me down. Jeremy said, no, I'm not.
No,
and you said, let me finish. You said, you did. I don't give a what you do. You let me down. I don't care if you go in there and play 100%. I'll get you, buddy. Cry about that.
No, that's when he wants to sit down and be lazy. Jeremy shut everybody out. I know him better than you or any of these people here. Jeremy, when he gets lazy, he ain't worried about the game or nothing. He'll just drop everything just to get back, just say, well, Dad, I don't want to play. To hell with the game.
What do you mean I'm going to get you tonight?
I don't know. I'll preach to him.
Are there circumstances under which you beat your child?
Oh, yeah.
Did you hear my question?
What's that?
I said, are there circumstances in which you beat your child?
I said, yeah.
You do beat your child?
I do. I spank him one time, yeah. I was raised like that, a little rough. I agree, Peter. All right? Not to be cut you off or nothing. But my dad, he was a little rough on me. And I try to treat Jeremy the way I was raised, but I guess it's a little rough sometimes. You're tough, boy, you're tough.
In Little League, coaches or managers who suspect that one of their kids is being abused are required to report to the league. No reports of abuse have been filed on behalf of Jeremy McAfee. The incidence of reported child abuse in Hagerstown is a little below the national average.
If Peter was intrigued by America, he was entranced by the idea of America.
Please welcome Peter Jennings.
He was an avid student of the U.S. Constitution and its history. With the Boston Pops 4 summers ago, he clearly enjoyed celebrating July 4th.
We remind ourselves what Jefferson wrote. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness.
Peter was somebody who actually walked around with a copy of the Constitution in his back pocket. And he did so ever since the bicentennial of the Constitution. He also had this sort of fascination with a nation that was built around a document. And the fact that you could take that document, short enough to read in 15 or 20 minutes, and stuff it in your back pocket and carry it with you as a sort of recipe for good behavior, I think was very appealing to him.
No knowledge of who's involved. No.
And when the nation built around that document came under siege, Peter was moved in ways that were not evident on the air.
I think finally, after many years in 2003, and he clearly was influenced, I think, in part by what happened on 9/11, in part by the fact that he had written a couple of books about the United States, that he felt he really needed to become a citizen.
Well, he came to me one day, and he said to me, you can't tell a soul. You must swear on the Bible you cannot tell a living soul that you're going to do this. But I have decided that I want to become an American citizen. He said, I've been thinking about it for a long time.
There were no announcements. There was no fanfare. Peter became a U.S. citizen so privately that his friend Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia was taken by surprise 5 weeks later.
It was a celebration of the 4th of July at the National Constitution Center across the square from Independence Hall, where the Constitution was hammered out. Peter was one of the speakers. He gave a really wonderful talk. It was a brief talk, 10 minutes or so, but it was very good. And when he finished and came down, sat next to me, I could not avoid saying that the devil makes me do it. I said, not bad for a Canadian. And he won up to me because his reply was, I'm an American citizen. I was surprisingly impressed by that. He just finally decided this is the country he wanted to be part of.
Part of the country that he helped bind together on its worst day. This is Peter at his anchor desk just after sunset, September 11th, 2001.
It is part of an important psychological process as well as a business one to say to the rest of the world, as Senator Tom Daschle did when he talked about Congress will be open for business tomorrow. And that has been reasserted as a government theme at both the state and the federal level throughout the day. And so this scene on the steps of the Capitol building tonight, just as the sun was going down, was very, very moving.
From the mountain to the prairie, to the ocean, wide with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, my home, sweet home.
The Walt Disney Company mourns the loss of Peter Jennings and wishes to express heartfelt sympathy to his family and to all of his friends and colleagues at ABC News.
He had a great appetite for life.
Jazz was one of his driving passions.
He loved his kids.
And his wife, Casey, he just adored her.
When he wasn't at the anchor desk, Peter was here in his office. Just look around the room. It is as he left it. An old radio mic, his father's typewriter. You can see Peter was a voracious reader, and his shelves are lined with books on every imaginable subject, particularly about America. As you can imagine, Peter won every possible award, but he also had humility and a sense of humor about where to keep them. Eskimo art, Tabasco, and jazz all stirred his senses. Above all else, though, he loved his family, his sister Sarah, his children Elizabeth and Christopher, and of course his wife Casey. Casey was totally devoted to him, and Peter was totally romantic with her, always calling her darling.
Hi, darling, how are you? It's my wife calling from Washington,
He looked to her, he reached for her, he touched her, and she him. Between the two of them, they were an unbeatable, unstoppable, and unparalleled team.
Casey, she's very special. I like to think that Peter, it was like a boat that found its mooring in this relationship. And they are a very special family.
He loved his family. He was never happier than when his children and his wife, Casey, were on a trip together somewhere or having an adventure or even just staying home and lying about watching videos, just like normal folks, if I can say.
We talked more about our personal lives and our personal interests than we did about business over the years, which is something I think that's been a bit lost the last few days. There's been so much done or talked about or written about his career. I mean, he was such a genuine person, and we shared a lot of interests. We both loved sailing, and we both loved jazz, and we loved to talk about how much we loved our wives.
When he was not on camera, he could be a little stiff on camera, but when he was in your living room, he was as real can be.
He kept his humility, and it's very hard when you're that famous. If you went to a book party or a function where there were a lot of people in the room, including a lot of fairly famous people in that room, Peter would notice the most vulnerable people in that room. A child, a spouse who was not well known, who seemed awkward. And he would go right for those people and talk to them, ignoring all the famous people in the room, all the people who basically wanted to talk to Peter Jennings.
Peter had a reputation as a ladies' man, which is true. Dare I say it, he was one of the sexiest guys around. But he really respected women's intelligence, and he totally respected what women could bring to the table, personally and professionally.
You might see this suave, debonair fellow, as he's called. I always laugh when I hear it, because one never sees one's brother that way. when he stepped off the stage, he wasn't pretentious about what he did. He didn't take himself as a diva. You know, his children had to make their own beds, and, you know, when they would come up to the cottage in the summer, they lived very simply. I would say Pete was unpretentious about his success and who he was.
On New Year's Eve, Peter would tend to wear a kilt, yes. It was part of his Scottish heritage, I guess. And he just thought it was hilarious. Peter had a sense of the divine silliness that would come out in him that was always still dignified.
Peter always took 3 weeks a year in Canada, and that was the touchstone of his year, I would say. And I always used to joke, the first week he'd come in, he'd be insufferable. The second week he'd be coming down to earth, and he could put on his shorts and pull on a pair of wool socks. You know, he loved to canoe, he would go sailing, he'd go swimming.
He was a natural athlete.
You played tennis with Peter. He was always trying to beat you and hit that ball.
He was totally exhausting, but he was so much fun to be with that he got your energy up.
He was really cheap. I mean, this was the other thing about Peter that was so amusing. He only bought, for years, second-hand cars. And he would be trundling his family around in these falling-apart cars, which would die by the side of the road. And he just was very anxious about money. He didn't want to be seen as anybody with money. And I think that he was just so bewildered that he had money himself. He just didn't know how to deal with it.
He did an annual Christmas party, which involved singing Christmas carols. And if you didn't sing Christmas carols at that party, you were almost out the door. Everybody had to participate.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is time for jazz.
One thing the Jennings did so brilliantly was to host Jazz at Jennings every June at their house for the last 9 years to benefit the Bridgehampton Child Care Center.
This was not a big deal, fancy, chic charity event. This was people in their T-shirts and their sweaters listening to wonderful music. Nobody enjoyed it more than Peter.
He loved the music. He loved it. If you would go to a jazz concert with Peter, he would be there bebopping in a way that I never thought any Canadian could do, any white Canadian. He really got it.
He also felt a tremendous loyalty to friends. There are countless stories of Peter's quiet generosity and caring.
My father was an anchor and a television correspondent with Peter, and he dropped dead suddenly. Peter could have easily said, well, I've just lost my best friend, but, you know, I'll check in with the daughter every so often over the years. Instead of that, he basically just adopted me.
What always impressed me is that this man who had achieved the heights of his profession in terms of personal fame and fortune and success never lost touch with the common man, in the sense that when people were in trouble, he really reached out to help them.
The first time I met Peter, I worked with a homeless organization here in New York City, and he wanted to be one of our volunteers.
Peter was a very compassionate person, and not in a generalized way. He was very specific and active about his compassion.
And Peter and I went out to a homeless shelter in one of the worst neighborhoods in New York in the middle of the night, into one of these large armories where there are 1,000 people on cots. And it was a scary place. And it was, when we walked in, it was clear to me that Peter had never seen anything like this. And it struck me because Peter was a worldly reporter who had seen everything. And here he was 40 blocks from his own home and saw this third world poverty that was right in his own city. And I think that struck him. And he never wanted anyone to know about it. He kept it very quiet.
Peter was the only man that I know who would address taxi drivers by name. You would sit in the back seat of the cab, Peter would read the ID thing, and he would say, oh, well, Mr. Green, or well, Mr. Kahn, how are you today? He wanted that connection.
He was a very complicated man. He was so human.
Peter was almost never satisfied. And you might also translate that to say that Peter was almost never happy. And because he was so demanding and because he pushed himself and others so hard, the downside of that was there was probably no time to sit back and reflect about how good things are and how enormously successful he had been.
And complacency, interestingly, is something I never saw. I saw contentment from time to time. I never saw complacency. Big difference. I think there were ways in which Peter was content, particularly in the last few years of his life. He was so immensely proud of Lizzie and Christopher.
The most important thing to Peter, I mean, bar none, I mean, forget ABC, it was his children.
Peter was a great father. His children were the very soul of his existence. He was so proud of his kids.
With his former wife, Cotty Martin, he had 2 children, Elizabeth and Christopher.
I think the important thing about Peter is while he led this very public life, he did keep his private life private and tried as best he could to live an ordinary private life, you know, have an ordinary or normal, let's say, family life, have his children go to school like other people's children, not to be idolized or adulated just because their father was a big star. So in a society which is very heavy on celebrity culture, I think he did his level best to avoid being a celebrity.
Oh, he was an amazing father. I mean, almost to a fault. He adored his children. He took it another level.
I think he was charmed by his son Christopher's interest in philosophy and law, and to the degree that a father lives through his son, I think that Peter did that with Christopher, but in the healthiest way.
And Lizzie was just the apple of his eye. He adored his daughter. And they'd go and have lunch together, just the 2 of them. It was very special.
Peter cried a lot. He was immensely sentimental.
Elizabeth? I'm especially moved today because Elizabeth has done something her father never did. Graduate from high school. What are the values you have learned so far? Where do you stand on what you owe to family? What will you stand up for?
As an anchor and a father, Peter again broke new ground. He began hosting town meetings for children, answering children's questions.
Do you think you're going to be able to live more peacefully together than your parents and grandparents did?
One of the reasons he was so deft with children was because he was shy himself. So he didn't go in and take over the room. He wouldn't go in and take over the table and give you a 30-minute lecture on his opinions on things.
But you know, you really raise, I think, the question that has puzzled so many Americans. That is wonderful, Bob. Thank you.
And then he'd teach them things. It was quite amazing, and they loved him. Kids just loved him.
He loved what he did. He loved the life he had. When he fell ill, the first thing he said to me, he said, "I've had such a great life. I've had such a good life." He was a lucky fellow in many ways.
Peter Jennings, reporter, continues.
You can't really understand Peter Jennings without understanding his role as the anchor of World News Tonight. And he took that job extremely seriously. It was much more than just a half an hour every night. It was an all-day and all-night job, really leading our coverage and decisions about what we covered throughout the world so that he could bring it to his audience every night at 6:30, and he regarded it as such from the very beginning.
Stand by, Peter. We're about to begin another new project at ABC News.
When Peter Jennings became the sole anchor of World News Tonight, he had a lot to prove to himself and the audience.
Well, we want to keep World News Tonight with Peter Jennings on the air for a long time, and with your help, we want to be successful. I am not personally suicidal.
And he was very candid about it. It scared the hell out of him. He was very frank. Hey, I'm not Walter Cronkite.
Where is that page? Les, I've lost my page. Just a sec, David. I got a problem. I've lost my own page, folks.
When Peter came to the chair, he didn't have that sense of confidence. But across, it's 22 years, across the first 5, 6, 7 years, as he began to understand that he really was powerful and could exercise that power in a very good way in terms of the content that was going to make air that night. I mean, he understood the power, and he used it properly.
Finally from us this evening, the problem which San Francisco cannot solve.
And over the years, he used that power to do stories that other broadcasts ignored, ones he thought mattered.
San Francisco doesn't know how many homeless it has, 8,000, 14,000. It depends who's counting.
Peter never wanted to waste precious airtime on stories that anybody else could do, that the tabloids could do, that anyone could do. He wanted to do the stories where he thought he could lend, that ABC News could lend, some special authority or information or background.
Whether it was a coverage of religion, whether it was a coverage of AIDS, Peter wanted to be on the leading edge of that story.
Hang on, no, I'm not quite ready. I'm rewriting these.
Peter's title was senior editor. It was certainly not a ceremonial title.
They're all rewritten, John. So.
Peter's edit control was absolute. I mean, anybody who wanted to take a piece of it, it was a wrestling match.
What a lot of people don't know who watch the show is that Peter edits every single script. Every reporter gives him their script before it goes on the air.
He would come in and he'd look at a script from the correspondent and say, I don't think that's quite right, or that's wrong, or he's moving in the wrong direction, or she really doesn't have an angle here that is worth a minute and a half.
There's just no other way to describe it but terrifying, to be sitting across his desk from an American icon, having him go line by line with a red pen over what you've written.
And you'd walk in and the script would be marked up, and paragraph 1 should be paragraph 8, and paragraph 7 should be paragraph 2, and you do it over your protest, and then it turned out, I'd say more times than not, to be much, much better. But he was very tough. He wanted stories told simply and clearly and direct, nothing too fancy.
The proudest moment I've had at ABC was one day I handed him a script. This happened once, and he handed it back to me with no changes.
Did you frame it?
No, but it was, I still remember what story it was. It was great.
2 minutes.
How long?
2 minutes.
Peter was passionate about what should be on his broadcast and what should not.
Before we leave tonight to review the testimony today at the O.J. Simpson preliminary hearing, the limousine driver who took Mr. Simpson to the airport the night of the murders.
Peter had extreme views about tabloid journalism. He hated the O.J. Simpson story. He hated the Michael Jackson story. He hated the, mother kills baby and found in the trunk of a car story. Let other people do that.
If the defense loses this motion to suppress the evidence, do they ever get to argue it again?
I think Peter was a little bit embarrassed by these stories, and I don't think he thought there was room for them on his broadcast. So Peter and I had many a wrangle about whether or not World News Tonight was an appropriate place to cover the O.J. Simpson trial or the Michael Jackson trial.
Peter was perhaps happiest, though, when he could get out of New York and take his show on the road.
I think that the moment Peter could get off the anchor desk, onto a plane, and hours later arrive in another country, for him that was bliss. He would step off that plane and he was go.
I remember a time we were in Moscow covering one summit or another, and they were all kind of boring, and we had a string of hours in which we didn't have to put on the broadcast, and Peter said, of course, let's go do a story. Well, what story would you like to do, Peter? He said, let's play the old game. And there was a map on the wall. He said, let's play the map game. And he closes his eyes and puts his finger on the map. And he said, let's go there and find a story.
30 miles from the Moscow city limits, the diminished state of life in the Russian heartland begins to show itself. They haven't much to sell, and they don't make much for it.
It's like so many successful journalists. He liked to find small stories that said something about bigger issues.
If there were 26 hours in the day, he would work 26 hours. Didn't matter what time zone, didn't matter what country.
work himself to the ground, and we followed suit.
If you're a competitor of Peter Jennings, you have to have him in your line of sight all the time. If Peter Jennings showed up on a story or was there when you got there, you knew that you weren't going to sleep very much, that you dare not.
He was so curious about every single thing that there was not a subject that he wasn't passionate about. He was one of the most passionate people I've ever met. Actually, he was the most passionate.
I feel so honored being with Peter on his last overseas trip, on his last visit to Iraq, to have seen that passion.
We set out for a forward base in a not-too-distant neighborhood.
He went to Mosul, and he went with Brigadier General Carter Ham, who was in charge of the area up there in Mosul. And they got fired upon. You can see Peter going down behind a wall, which I later said, "Why didn't you have your helmet on, Peter Jennings?"
Just have them scan the sector. Everybody, just calm everybody down.
He came back that evening, and he was so fired up, and he said, "You know, Martha, I think I was pretty cool. I think I was pretty cool." He said, "You know, Brigadier General Ham seemed a little uptight." And I said, "I'll tell you why he was uptight." The whole time he was thinking, "Oh my God, I'm going to get Peter Jennings killed."
I think Peter had amazing forethought in terms of covering a lot of these stories. I remember specifically a trip that we took to interview General Tommy Franks, who was the commander at that time. It was a tough interview. There were tough questions that he threw at Tommy Franks, and it was clear that Peter wanted to get some answers for the American public.
Let me ask you the question that Americans want to know. Do you have enough men to win the war, and do you have enough men to win the peace?
We have sufficient military capacity to do the job that America's military would be asked to do.
And it almost seemed to some, I think, that Peter was badgering General Franks on a point that didn't seem so relevant on the verge of war. Okay, we have a war to fight. Why are you worrying so much about, do you have the troops to win the peace? And I don't think many people would argue with the fact that that was a pretty, in retrospect, certainly a pretty appropriate question to be asking at the time.
That was just a very classic example of Peter having forethought on a story, or seeing the story in a way that perhaps other people hadn't yet thought.
Mark Burstein, go pay attention to me.
He never let us forget the world and World News Tonight, and he didn't let his audience forget that either. And I think he covered the world the way he thought was important, and respected the audience enough that they'd watch us the information, make their own decision about what we had said. But he had enormous respect, and I think he didn't realize how much respect the audience had for him, or the connection he had to his audience, really, until I think he got sick.
Though his illness forced Peter off the air, World News Tonight was still his broadcast. While being treated for cancer, he directed the troops by phone. One of his last calls was on the morning of the London bombings.
And he got on that phone, and I don't think he said more than, probably 30 seconds worth. He was very succinct and very detailed about some points he wanted us to make. He wanted to make sure we gave a very, very vivid picture of where these things had happened. He said, don't forget, Americans know London. Give them some feel not just of where those 4 attacks happened, but show them where Buckingham Palace is or where Big Ben is as a reference point. I personally felt, almost more than I think any other story that had broken since he'd gotten sick, that this was not just a terrorist attack, but it was a terrorist attack in a city he was so intimately familiar with. It was just another one of those days where it hit home, man, we need him here. Sorry.
The Walt Disney Company mourns the loss of Peter Jennings and wishes to express heartfelt sympathy to his family and to all of his friends and colleagues at ABC News.
Is in the 10 to 52 different kind of territory.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Steinberg, very much for joining us.
Peter disliked intensely any suggestion that the audience wasn't going to care about or be interested in a story. He felt it's an example of laziness. If you said, I can't imagine the audience can care about that, he said, make them care.
And he did. In groundbreaking reports, he covered the most uncomfortable problems of our time: AIDS, ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, prisoners at Guantanamo Bay.
He wanted to use the leverage and the clout that he had created over an entire career, wandering the world, doing some extraordinary reporting, to do one more thing, and that is tell people stories they couldn't find anywhere else.
This is an ABC News special. Peter Jennings reporting.
Good evening and welcome. This hour is about cigarettes and the people who make them.
It is an irony not lost on his colleagues here at ABC that some of his most effective reporting was the work he did investigating the tobacco industry.
One reason Peter felt so strongly about reporting on tobacco is that he himself spent many, many years as a smoker, and he understood the addictive power of tobacco and its potentially destructive power.
I can remember absolutely as clear as yesterday that Pete was about 11 and I was 8. And of course, one of the things to do was to get hold of Granny's cigarettes and to have a puff. And all he did was say, now, sir, all you have to do is breathe in, which of course I did immediately because I did everything my brother asked me to do. And of course had this tremendous coughing fit, and I was traumatized. Pete did become obviously heavily addicted to cigarettes and smoked heavily all his life until he had his children, and then he was able to give it up through tremendously strong effort. He used hypnosis and other methods, but he did manage to stop smoking when his children were born.
Another reason Peter felt it was essential to report on tobacco is that it's the #1 public health problem in the United States. And he felt, and he's right, that the government, the tobacco companies, and journalists have not done enough to inform people about the dangers of it and to change it.
In 1994, we had done some really aggressive reporting at ABC with other reporters and aired a bunch of different stories that infuriated the tobacco industry. In fact, Philip Morris sued ABC for $10 billion. And as a result of that, there were a lot of people at ABC who basically made us back off the story. Peter didn't like that.
When the questions were first raised about the reporting that ABC had done, ABC News had done about tobacco, Peter was not involved in that, but I was. He came to me and said, "What'd you do? Did you screw it up?" And I said, "No, Peter, we didn't." And he said, "Okay, prove it to me."
And he wanted to go over all the facts, and he wanted to make sure what we did was sound.
And once we could prove to Peter, to his own satisfaction, that our original reporting was strong and supportable, he said, "We're not backing off this story. I don't care what the corporation has done. We've got to keep going." And it's because of that that we started reporting on tobacco.
Peter Jennings reporting. Never Say Die. How the cigarette companies keep on winning.
The FDA has already told us this in writing.
He investigated the influence of tobacco money in politics.
When the tobacco companies give you money, what do you think they want from you?
Well, not many do, even according to the people that compile the list.
I've never... Quite a number do. RGR gives you money. Brown and Williamson, Philip Morris, U.S. Tobacco, the Tobacco Institute, Nabisco.
He investigated the marketing of cigarettes to kids.
Why do you think so many people out here have the notion that R.J. Reynolds knew that Joe Camel would appeal to people under 18?
I suppose they think everything in tobacco is a devious plot.
And there's nothing to that at all.
There are no devious plots. There were no plans to attract anyone under 18.
Why do you think R.J. Reynolds settled on a cartoon character?
I don't think of Joe Camel as a cartoon.
Oh, really?
No. I think of Joe Camel as a person
As a result of Peter's commitment, we did scores of stories about the tobacco issue that aired on World News Tonight.
For the second day in a row, we've heard a major tobacco executive admitting that smoking is a serious... Some people think that tobacco companies are so desperate for a deal they will pay any price. Today, the president is considering whether to step more deliberately into the tobacco wars. Mr. Parrish, if you are genuine about this and you want to keep cigarettes away from children, how do you make money?
Well, we believe... At the time, I think my view was this was somebody who was very interested in an issue that he thought was very important, and he was very intense, and he was very persistent in how he was going to cover it. But he always did it in a fair and very thorough way, presenting all sides.
Imagine for a moment that 3 jumbo jets full of passengers crash every single day of the year, and everyone on board every plane dies. That horror would be equal to the toll that cigarettes take every day, 365 days every year.
Peter understood that the tobacco story was not just about looking at the tobacco industry. It was about the actions of government. It was about personal responsibility.
As some of you now know, I have learned in the last couple of days that I have lung cancer. Yes, I was a smoker until about 20 years ago, and I was weak, and I smoked over 9/11.
Shortly after Peter Jennings was diagnosed with lung cancer, I wrote him a personal note of support. In it, I thought it was important for him to understand that even as he was suffering through the difficulties of lung cancer, he should be aware that he had probably done more than anybody else in his field to ensure that fewer people would suffer from lung cancer and fewer kids would ever start smoking.
I think looking back over the years of the coverage of Peter Jennings and his team at ABC, that our company certainly views things very differently than we did before. Our company's changed because of what he did. And I think, in fact, the entire tobacco industry in this country has changed in ways it wouldn't have changed without Peter Jennings.
Peter had a very strong sense of spirituality, and religion was one of the things he was insatiably curious about. He was a constant seeker.
You know, Peter can't help himself. If he cares about something, he wants you to know about it. It's just in his genes.
He wanted to share his enthusiasms with his audience, and he trusted them. He trusted them to be just as intelligent as he was.
And where was Judas the betrayer? Where was Jesus?
And just as capable of having their curiosity piqued by something as he was.
We've all seen the famous scenes, at least in the movies, of Christ being walked through the streets of Jerusalem. What do you think it was really like?
You see, the beam would have been strapped to his shoulders, you see? And then, of course, when you can't see the steps, you fall. And if your arms are strapped back, you can't protect your face.
He wanted to know what the roots of Christianity were, why they played out the way they did. And he tried to answer that question. And he had a great time doing it.
And it would have been a piece of work for Jesus to get through something like this.
Yes, especially if there were crowds.
And I said, you know, this is really interesting. We could do a whole documentary about Jesus. And he said, oh, yeah, let's do it. And I thought, they are never going to do a documentary about Jesus. And Peter went to our bosses, and he said, I'm doing a documentary about Jesus. And he did.
Oh, little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie.
When they saw her belly was bigger and bigger, they asked her, from where that came? You are not married. She said, it's from the Spirit of God.
Why do you think Jesus was born in Bethlehem? Why here?
This is something, why I born here, I don't know.
He was asking very basic questions, ones that cut very close to the bone or very close to the heart for millions of Americans. For those who believe in Jesus as the Savior, does it really matter whether he was born in Bethlehem or not? Is that really of the essence?
Where you born? You?
Toronto.
What?
Canada.
Canada. Why?
Jesus surely heard the stories of what the Romans did here at Sepphoris to the people who rebelled against them. After all, he didn't live very far away. That is the present-day city of Nazareth, just snaking in across the hills over there.
It was, at the time, a revolutionary idea. And this was now long before things like the Da Vinci Code and all of the other programs that have come along behind.
Here in the Garden of Gethsemane, Father O'Connor thinks he sees evidence that Jesus could have escaped if he had wanted to.
Originally, this was a very ancient staircase, you see, and this is the easiest spot to climb the Mount of Olives.
He was wildly enthusiastic about historical Jesus and the origins of Christianity in the Middle East, and in fact talked about it, well, some would say ad nauseum. I mean, people would begin to glaze over at dinner tables because he was so, as ever, fascinated by whatever subject he was pursuing, and in this case, it was the historical Jesus.
When Peter got on fire with a topic, he would not let it go.
What do you think he looked like?
Blue eyes, sort of lighter skin.
He was a perfect man, 6 foot tall, blue eyes.
What color eyes do you think he had?
Blue.
Was he tall or short, do you think?
Like your size.
My size?
Yeah. You know, you'd be standing on an airport line, and Peter would, turn to the person behind him and, and start grilling them. I mean, imagine you're standing on line in the airport, and this guy turns around, and it's Peter Jennings, and he's in your face, and for some reason he's saying to you, what do you think Jesus really looked like?
We're going to take a closer look tonight at religion and the presidential campaign.
He and I had talked about the need for us to find ways of covering religion and faith.
On the agenda tonight, our religion reporter Peggy Waymeyer.
Peter was the first and only network news anchor who agitated for and campaigned for a full-time religion beat. It was revolutionary.
All across America, Christianity transformed in an effort to keep church-going alive.
Despite the things that you don't understand.
As a reporter in the Middle East and in Europe, he had covered so many wars that were often fueled by religious passion. And Peter understood the role of religion in people's lives, for good and for bad.
Once you cover stories in Jerusalem and Beirut and Syria, you begin to sense, especially if you've grown up an ocean away in North America, the reality of the stories in the Bible.
The forums are surrounded by temples, civic buildings known as basilicas, and honorary buildings to honor victorious generals.
And are we now down at the first century level? This is what anybody arriving in town would see?
Yes, absolutely.
He loved scrambling around on those archaeological digs with the archaeologists and the scientists and learning how they did their job.
Ready?
He went scuba diving off the coast of Israel to see a sunken Roman harbor.
That's quite unbelievable.
Or, we'd go to the town where the apostles Peter and James and a few others might have come from.
If you look at that kitchen over there, for instance, it had 2 ovens, yes.
The 2-oven family was a pretty well-off family.
It's like 2 microwaves. How many houses have 2 microwaves today? Well, I do, actually, but I'm an exception rather than the rule.
He would come back with tales of the biblical scholars that he would meet and the questions that he would ask.
Unbelievable. How does this go from these itinerant Jewish preachers showing up here to the point of being the state religion? Unbelievable. It really is unbelievable,
I said, I remember we were leaving one of these archaeological sites at one point, and he just had to, he grabbed my cell phone and he called his wife Casey and he said, darling, guess where I've been? I've just been walking around all day in the 1st century.
I wouldn't describe Peter as a religious person, but I would describe him as someone who had enormous curiosity about spiritual issues. And I'm not sure they ever were resolved through his life. But exploring them was just so fascinating to him. He couldn't help himself.
It is the man who inspired such astounding faith, such beautiful stories, who we were looking for.
He just loved it, and he was utterly convinced that if he could tell that story to you, you'd love it too.
What really happened in this tiny corner of the world during the brief time that Jesus lived here? We kept looking and asking because something about being in this place, walking the same hills and roads that he did, standing at the sites people have venerated for centuries, it all gives you the strange feeling that maybe you can find the answers, if only you just look around the next corner, or the next one, or the next one.
Peter Jennings, reporter, continues.
When we have a national tragedy, we all turn on our television sets to be reassured that our lives are intact and that our lives have meaning. And I have the privilege of sitting at the center for periods of time, and I'm very conscious of the fact that I don't want to be pushing my emotions on other people, my opinions, my analysis, my sense of context about why something is happening, yes.
That critical moment for people who've just joined us occurred, as you've been telling us, thank you, with 90 seconds roughly after liftoff.
The day the Challenger exploded, Peter had to come on the air for, I think we did 6 hours straight. And he had to basically be the voice that the country heard. He had to be the sane person in an insane world.
Almost the very first explanation, or perhaps explanation, was that it occurred as they went from power up. And here we see it again. You can see on the outside there, of course, those are the solid rocket boosters. And listening to John Lyons, ABC's longtime space observer, coming back on the radio in the taxi, John was saying, of course, if it is those solid rocket boosters which go, they would drive the Challenger itself totally out of control.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
There it is. There's the phrase, throttle up, which means they're going to increase from about 65.
There was the explosion.
There it is.
He began to do on the air that day, and then again on the show that night, and then again in the special we did that night. He began to do what Walter Cronkite did the day Jack Kennedy got shot.
We're very much, as much in the dark as you are. We haven't heard much more from Mission Control than the bare basics. And it is, I think, probably, Steve, to some extent a reflection of how successful the space program has been, and the shuttle program particularly, that those of us, like you and me, who followed the space programs with absolute passion 10 and 15 years ago, have begun to take it rather like the country did, rather casually, not knowing all of the details of every mission as intimately as we would have 10 or 15 years ago.
Peter did not know a lot about the space shuttle at that point in his life. And he was on the air, and I was on the air, and there were many, many other people on the air. I was astounded. He got it all right. And what he didn't get right, he was smart enough to ask. He would turn to me and he would ask a question.
Lynn, explain, if you would, a detail to me. We were listening, as you know, to the, and I've just had the transcript of the final communications between Challenger and Mission Control. We hear absolutely nothing after we hear the Mission Control commander say, throttle up. And he goes right on talking, even though the explosions occurred. Why might that be?
What they are doing, Peter, keep in mind, is not looking out the window. They are not watching the shuttle lift off the way the spectators are and the way we are on television. They are looking at screens. They're looking at monitors. They're looking at printouts. And they're reading their numbers. And their numbers did not tell them what, in fact, had happened. And he would listen. He would listen to the answer. He would figure it out. He would come out with stuff that was dead on, spot on. He had never covered the space shuttle in his life.
And it sounds very much like, Lynn, given the speed with which everything happened, that the crew never knew what happened either.
I think that's absolutely true. And I know, and everybody in this business knows, there were people feeding him material, and there were people talking into his ear.
We have tape now of the
Steve,
seven...
just before you go, hey, let me just interrupt, because somebody did say to me a moment ago that, in fact, Challenger does not have the escape capsule. Columbia did in one of its early stages. We've had 24 of these missions. Columbia had it, Challenger did not. So what we were not seeing an escape capsule falling some 20, 30 miles out into the Atlantic.
He's the one that put it all together. Peter's the one on that which was certainly the first of many awful days we've shared as a nation on the air. Peter gave our viewers an anchor, a sense of calm, a sense of understanding, not a false sense of everything's okay, but a real sense of we're trying to get on top of this.
The word I always used to describe Peter was steady, and he became a really steady force through that broadcast.
This is a special report from ABC News.
It is 9:30 in Los Angeles in the morning. It is 12:30 Eastern Time, and it is 10:30 in Oklahoma City, or 11:30 in Oklahoma City at the moment. And this is what has happened: a major explosion.
On just about any subject, any breaking news you want to know, he knew a lot about it when he sat down in the chair. So he was not merely a pipe through which we were feeding information. He was not merely a broadcaster. He was bringing his own editorial sense and background to the editing process as we watched it happen on the air.
As someone who has experienced a car bomb, I can tell you it is among the worst experiences in the world.
And then he had what all special events broadcasters have. I mean, he had a great iron seat. I mean, he could sit for hours. I mean, he had he had a bladder that must have been, larger than an elephant, because he could stay on the air for hours and never have to get up.
As we sit here a little after 9 o'clock Eastern Time, 6 o'clock in the West,
doing the hours on end. He knew when to let a moment speak for itself, and that was probably his single greatest strength, that he knew when to be quiet.
Let's listen.
Peter always knew when to signal to me, because he was, and you would know that he wanted the audience to listen.
He seemed calm. He seemed strong. He knew what he was talking about, and he kept us calm and strong.
I don't always keep my composure. I sometimes lose it. I try not to let the public see that I'm losing it. My friends and my family are always amazed when people say that I'm calm, because I'm not always calm by any means. You wouldn't be emotional if you were calm all the time. Someone get my earpiece, please. It's here. But I think it's probably true that the worse things get around me, the cooler I tend to be.
ABC's Peter Jennings is at the anchor desk uptown here in New York and is now in position. Peter, I suspect you
I tend to focus very hard under pressure, which I think serves a journalist or an anchor person pretty well. We are, Charlie, we've been watching it from the beginning, and we'll be watching this for much of the day. There is chaos in New York at the moment. There have been not one but two incidents, as Charlie and Diane have so ably reported so far. The second one coming at 9:03, when television was on live, and you could see what was clearly a jet aircraft flying into the second trade tower. Both trade towers now, these 110-story high towers, have now been hit. There is chaos
here. He could respond to the events that were particular and daunting and horrific and report them in detail. And at the same time, he could think broadly and conceptually. At the same time.
I think the single most powerful image for me is the one I actually didn't notice when it was occurring. I think it was beyond our imagination at the moment. All aircraft currently in the air over the United States have been ordered to land at the nearest airport.
I think
Hang on a sec, John. I just want to check one thing, because, John, we now have what do we have? We don't...
It looks like a new plume, a new large plume of smoke.
Peter, it's Don Daler down here. I'm 4 blocks north of the World Trade Center. The second building that was hit by the plane has just completely collapsed. The entire building has just collapsed. It folded down on itself, and it is not there anymore.
The whole side has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed.
The whole building has collapsed?
The building has collapsed.
We're talking about massive casualties here at the moment, and we have... I mean, that is very shocking to me, because now you see the images, and it all seems so cut and dried. It all seems so utterly clear. Plane hits, building falls down, building falls down. Well, it wasn't that way at all on the day. We were immersed in confusion and almost suffocated by chaos.
It was an enormously emotional period for the nation, and there was sufficient emotion with the issue itself that anchors didn't need to plaster another layer on. And that's what was so good about Peter. He could deal with a very emotional issue, but yet do it in a way that there was a certain confidence and calmness in his demeanor. And that confidence and calmness could help stabilize the situation and help bring the American people back to normalcy.
I mean, looking backward now, Peter was the perfect person to be the anchor for 9/11. Now that sounds strange to say anyone could be the perfect person for such a horrible tragedy, but that's the truth of the matter. Everything that he had learned, everything he had studied, every skill he had developed, all of his personality on the air and behind, all of his character, made him the best person to try to help us through that very difficult time.
I'm very conscious, particularly at a time of crisis, not to be hysterical and not to get worked up, because I think there's some danger that everybody else is getting worked up, and one of the roles I think we can play is to give people information and perspective in a quiet, reasonably sober sort of way.
Stand by. They seem to have the problem at the North Tower.
Oh my God.
And then the second building fell, and he was quieting all of us down. He just wanted that moment of silence. He just wanted us to be respectful to what we were seeing.
Both trade towers, where thousands of people work on this day, Tuesday, have now been attacked and destroyed.
You know what I think was most important? That in times of crisis, like 9/11, or times of great celebrations, it was Peter Jennings that this country turned to. More than anyone else, I'm not flagging our own flag. I'm telling you this is the way it was.
I really think it's almost without question he was the best ever as an anchor in breaking news. I don't think there has ever been a peer of his in that area.
We're going to have a quick change of shift here, but ABC News coverage will continue, period. Thank you very much. I'm Peter Jennings.
The Walt Disney Company mourns the loss of Peter Jennings and wishes to express heartfelt sympathy to his family and to all of his friends and colleagues at ABC News.
The legacy he gave each of us who worked with him is to strive to be as caring, as thorough, as passionate about our work as he was.
He was someone who understood that he was invested with authority and that his success depended upon his people trusting him as a trusted voice, that he was going to try and get at the truth. He wasn't going to impose his opinion. He wasn't going to make wisecracks. He was going to try and dig deeper to help you, because he worked for you. He didn't work for ABC. He really worked for the public, and he understood that.
I think he stood for integrity, and that will be his legacy, I think. I think it'd be very hard for us to do anything but a newscast that he would be proud of.
He is the one who said, we have to do this. The audience may not always want to hear about this, but we have to do this. We have a responsibility to cover this, and we should cover it as often as possible.
Peter was someone who really and truly cared about people and about the world in which we live. And he wanted, as much as he possibly could, to be able to help people understand each other.
I think his overwhelming legacy is that if you really care about your children and the children of your country, then you have to care about the children of the world.
His ability to show empathy for people who were suffering, his ability to put a sharp point sometimes on great events.
There are all kinds of public policy issues in this country that are different today because Peter decided that they were important issues, they were important stories, and they needed attention.
He taught us that there are those stories. They can be found. They are out there somewhere. If we open our eyes and we're open to what's going on in the world and we think about the importance of events, we can find the next Bosnia.
He was never scared to report a very complicated story because he didn't think people would get it. He thought people would get it.
He had very high standards, and I would like to believe that the people that worked around him,
in having more demanded of them and raised up to a new level of performance. His legacy is the rest of us who now carry that on.
And who better to learn from? And now you have this generation, and of course none of us could live up to what he was individually, but as a group we could carry on all the things he taught us.
He's gone, but we'll hear him, we'll feel him, we'll understand the world a little better, simply because there are a lot of other journalists out there who are trying to achieve what Peter was able to achieve.
Simply seeing someone who stands for quality by his own definition, this is quality and I will not move, strengthens us.
Peter, in his own extraordinary way, stood for a lot, and people knew it.
The pursuit of truth at all cost and with no effort spared. He just was doggedly determined to find out the truth about whatever subject he was exploring.
Without him as a leader here, a lot of people wonder how we'll be able to do our jobs, and I think that the way to get through that is to just think about what he would do, and that's what everyone is going to try.
I think Peter's greatest strength is that he was able to live a journalist's life with the right values. He believed that the truth matters, and when you find it, keep looking.
For 4 decades, millions and millions of Americans got their news from Peter Jennings.
This summer, it's your chance to experience